Today is the deadline for candidates to qualify for the next presidential primary debates, and Tulsi Gabbard has not made it. Now, there are several reasons why her exclusion is so egregious that I think are worth underscoring, and to do so, it's best, in my judgment, to set aside whatever wider problems you might have with polling writ large. So a lot of people are very cynical about the methodology of polls, whether they can be relied upon as accurate gauges of voter sentiment, etc. That's a worthwhile discussion to have. Polls are open for skepticism for sure, but it is worth highlighting that even using polls as reliable barometers of voter sentiment, that is, if you accept polling as roughly accurate, Tulsi ought to qualify. It's only due to the arbitrary criteria that the DNC has preemptively instituted to cull the field that Tulsi has been excluded. And here's one point on that score that I think people need to be aware of. There has only been one approved poll in the past 5 weeks from the early states in the primary cycle of New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. Now, there is no national primary. We don't hold one voting day where everybody across the country comes to vote to nominate presidential candidates. It is a protracted months-long process, and New Hampshire, for example, is the first primary state. Iowa comes first with its caucus, but the first state where there is a primary election held is in New Hampshire. And in the past 5 weeks, there have been 0 polls that are deemed by the DNC to be qualifying or approved that have been published. So what the DNC is doing is it's over-relying on national polls to determine what candidates are given this monumental boost or this monumental deficit of appearing in the televised national debates. And on top of that, they're not using certain other polls conducted by reputable organizations that show different results. So you don't have to totally dismiss the utility of all polling to criticize the illogical rule system that has been imposed upon the process by the DNC using criteria that are basically constructed in secret. Just this week alone, Tulsi has passed the polling threshold, 2% or more, in 2 separate national polls, but because of the DNC's mysterious decision-making here, those polls aren't deemed approved. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why is that so? Well, we don't know. The DNC won't say. In New Hampshire in particular, which again is in some ways the most important state, maybe second only to Iowa. I mean, you can argue it one way or another, but it's at least among the most important states in the entire process and dictates what the trajectory of the rest of the race is going to be. Tulsi is still ahead of several competitors in the polling averages, ahead of competitors who have already qualified for the debates. So she's ahead of Cory Booker, Andrew Yang, Beto O'Rourke, Amy Klobuchar, Julian Castro. All those people have qualified for the debates, and yet Tulsi's ahead of them in one of the crucial early primary states. So if somebody tells you that you're a conspiracy theorist or you're trying to foment dissent or dissension, or you're ignoring the rules that were set out and you should have known better, point them to that statistic and ask how that makes any sense. You're right to ask questions about that. You're right to perceive it as an unjustified, arbitrary distinction being made between the candidates. And, if these know-it-alls in the media want to wag their fingers at you, wag it right back and say, look at the polling averages, buddy. Tell me how that makes any sense. It does not. I've mentioned this before, but one of the polls that contributes to that average in New Hampshire is a poll conducted by a very reputable organization, arguably the most reputable organization that could conduct a poll in New Hampshire, which is the Boston Globe, the newspaper with the widest circulation in the state, in conjunction with Suffolk University, which is seen as the gold standard for all pollsters in New England. And that poll has been excluded for reasons that nobody will tell us. So, if you are frustrated by that, or if you want further information, you're not somebody who's a crank, right? You're not somebody who's asking something that is totally out of the bounds of reasonable consideration. That's why I sort of urge to forget about the wider polling methodology issue for now. Look at the polls that have been published. They suggest strongly that Tulsi ought to be in the debate, and if she's being excluded, then it's incumbent on us, it's incumbent on the media, you would think, although they're not interested really, to ask why. Michael Bennett put out a letter that he sent to Tom Perez, the chairman of the DNC, raising what I think are several very pertinent questions. Now, granted, Michael Bennett is not a terribly viable candidate, but nonetheless, he's raising criticisms that I think should have a fair airing. Here is, I think, probably the most salient point he raises in his letter, which was put out publicly and also sent to Tom Perez. Quote, "Who at the DNC decided which polls would be sanctioned? What was the specific criteria for allowing certain polls and not others? And why has that not been publicly disclosed? For example, why are polls from reputable polling organizations such as Suffolk University, Marist College, and Siena College excluded from the DNC's approved list?" Absolutely valid point. Suffolk University, just like I mentioned, is the Boston Globe's pollster and put Tulsi above the threshold for inclusion in the debates. And we have no rationale. We have no explanation for why that poll has been excluded. Bennett asked another question. Was anyone who is now on the staff of a presidential campaign consulted about the debate qualification rules? Interesting question. We know that operatives who work for campaigns kind of flow freely back and forth between party organizations and the campaign that they work on for a set period of time. So it stands to reason that some of them may have had a hand in consulting with the DNC and how they crafted these rules. So Bennett is perfectly justified in raising that question, and he deserves an answer. We don't know for sure that, for example, a Kamala Harris or a Joe Biden has people who are involved in these discussions, but it's at least a reasonable concern to raise, especially given the DNC's history. Bennett asks further, why is the DNC in an unprecedented rush to eliminate candidates from a volatile field 5 months before the first vote is cast? Exactly. The first contest in this cycle is not until February. And what the DNC is doing is an unprecedented imposition on the trajectory of the race that really doesn't have any historical, again, precedent. It didn't used to be that the debates were the be-all, end-all, and the party apparatus had a direct say in who participated in that. Was basically the end of your campaign if you didn't qualify using these cockamamie criteria. The process was a little more dispersed, meaning that there were various other organizations that could host forums and debates and everything else. But the DNC, in coordination with its media partners, has taken on such an outsized role in the process that, of course, it's going to breed cynicism and skepticism. And I think Bennett is correct to raise that point. He further asks, did the DNC consult with television networks on the debate requirements? Are television networks making decisions to limit candidates from the debate? Very well could be the case. The DNC is partnering with TV networks who have a commercial interest, above all, in how they organize these debates. And for the next debates in September, if a Tulsi or a Steyer or somebody else, Steyer's probably not the greatest example because he's buying himself a slot or had attempted to anyway. If another candidate had qualified, ABC News, who's hosting the debate, would have had to hold two separate debates on two separate nights. And arguably, that would have been contrary to their commercial interest, because you almost want to make it this one-night blockbuster event where all the primetime candidates are on the stage together. And divvying them up on two separate nights could kind of dilute their ratings feasibly, and therefore they would have an interest in keeping it at 10, which it just so happens to be right now. So Bennett, I think, is, again, correct to raise that question. And he lastly asks, why are candidates prohibited from participating in non-DNC forums and debates that would allow the voters the opportunity to hear in-depth discussion, given the DNC's refusal to hold issue-specific debates? Right. Why is the party apparatus such a central and determinative force in how these candidates can get their message out to the voters in a collective way? It didn't always used to be this way. This is a relatively historically anomalous co-optation by the party structure in dictating these types of events. So, whether there will be a backlash to the DNC that is sufficient to cause them to reevaluate their process here, I think remains to be seen. I've already heard from Tulsi supporters who have told me that they are now going to be protesting Democratic Party functions, and that should be interesting to observe. If this process makes you cynical, I think you're correct, but you should be I would encourage being wise and prudent in how you voice that skepticism. Although it should be said that the fact that the candidate who is most egregiously disadvantaged by these arbitrary rules just happens to be the candidate who is most forthrightly challenging bipartisan foreign policy consensus is very interesting. She's the one who you'd probably expect to be just on the cusp of entering into these debates, and then, excluded using criteria that don't hold up to any logical scrutiny. And so it is the case. And bear in mind, again, that she's demonstrated through a variety of other metrics that she has at least adequate, you would think, support from a grassroots level to be included, not least that she has roughly 170,000 individual donors. I mean, that's got to indicate something, correct? Not according to the DNC. They are sticking to these rules and won't give any rationale for them. Now, as far as what this portends for Tulsi's campaign individually, I think there could be a somewhat silver lining if you're a supporter, in that perhaps over the next couple of weeks, now that she's not going to be in the next debate, maybe she'll become even more unguarded. Maybe she'll let loose a little bit and throw some bombs and really be even more vigorous about getting her message out there, calling out institutions like the DNC, calling out some of the other candidates a little more strenuously, really kind of pushing the envelope. And so, maybe ultimately there will be some upside to this. Although, of course, it would have been better if you're a supporter and if you're a campaign for her to be in the debates. And, from my perspective, yes, I believed on a substantive level that she ought to be in the debates, because she has a different worldview. She has a different set of kind of philosophical principles that I think enhance the overall nature of the debate. She operates on a sort of a different set of ideological priors than basically anybody else running, and that just lends itself to a healthier discourse. And on top of that, she's obviously not shy about going after individual rivals when they're talking nonsense, the most notable example obviously being Kamala Harris in the most recent debate. That said, she still has a chance of being in the October debates because her two qualifying polls now carry over to the October threshold. So she has every incentive to stay around and keep it going. But that said, this reflects badly on the DNC, and they've only brought it upon themselves. And if this creates internal dissension, then they have nobody else to blame. Again, but their bosses who are making these secretive decisions and not being anywhere near transparent enough in how those decisions are arrived at. So, stay tuned, and I'll talk to you later.